Welcome to the Zen Studies Podcast. I'm Domio Burke. Thanks, as usual, to new supporting members of the podcast. Augustine from Elmer, New Jersey. Brad from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Carrie from Norwich in the UK. Maru from Zapopan in Mexico. And Marcella from Madison, Wisconsin. This episode is the beginning of a reflection on Dogen's fascicle or essay called Bussho, or the Buddha Nature. I will do at least one more episode on Bussho because a group of students at my Zen Center are studying it over the course of the next 4 to 5 months. I can't promise to cover the whole text, which is over 30 pages long and incredibly dense. But hopefully, whatever I do cover will be interesting and helpful. I enjoy taking my time with this kind of reflection, pausing to explore and play with words and phrases, imagery, metaphors, and concepts. So, very brief recap of the teaching of Buddha nature before we get into it. Zen Master Dogen, who was writing this article, lived from 1200 to 1253 and was a prolific writer. His teachings and texts are widely studied by Soto Zen Buddhists in modern times, and he's well known for taking traditional Buddhist and Zen teachings and turning them inside out in the pursuit of radical non-dualism. To fully appreciate what Dogen is doing in Bussho, I highly recommend listening to or reading my previous episodes on Buddha nature before you read or listen to this one, if you haven't done so recently. And those are episode 203, Buddha nature, what the heck is it and how do we realize it? And 239, One Reality, Many Descriptions, Part 3, Buddha nature. To summarize very briefly by way of context and introduction, Buddha nature is a concept that arose as part of Mahayana Buddhism, a branch of Buddhism that started evolving several centuries after the Buddha's death. And originally in Buddhism, it was viewed that a person and their tendencies were just a direct result of past choices in this lifetime or previous lifetimes. People had no inherent nature, but were free to shape their future in a positive way through Buddhist practice. The Mahayanists saw things differently, proposing that our true nature is that of a Buddha, awake to the truth, compassionate, selfless, generous, and full of equanimity. Because of our self-centered greed, anger, and ignorance, all of it based on delusion, our true nature is obscured. Through practice, we can awaken to reality, see through our delusions, see that all things are impermanent. The self is empty of any inherent and independent nature. And suffering arises because of our resistance to the truth, to reality. Then the qualities of a Buddha flow naturally. The aim of practice, then, is to uncover or discover your Buddha nature, as opposed to remaking yourself into an enlightened person through sheer force of will over the course of many lifetimes. Ultimately, of course, it's not so easy to awaken to your Buddha nature. It takes time and study, work, and practice. And the teachings make it clear that your Buddha nature doesn't really do you any good unless you awaken to it. So, in practice, the Mahayana way, at least in Chan or Zen and Vajrayana Buddhism, it involves as much meditation and study and self-cultivation as Buddhist practice that doesn't include the concept of Buddha nature, such as Theravada. Before I get started on my reflections on Bussho, a few words about how to approach Dogen's writings. I've talked about this before, especially in episode 242, Reflections on San Sui Kyo, Dogen's Mountains and Waters Sutra, so I won't go on too long here. However, before delving into a text as potentially befuddling as Bussho, I think it's important to remind you of a few things. So one, in his profound writings like Bussho, Dogen is not explaining. Instead, he's using words and images and concepts in unusual and creative ways to evoke or provoke a response in your heart and mind. In Zen, we use the moon as a metaphor for the truth and say the teachings are like a finger pointing at the moon. So don't focus on the finger, but instead look for the moon that is pointing at. The message Dogen is trying to convey can't be found within his words, but lies beyond his words. 2, the teachings and fascicles like Bussho are always pointing us toward the absolute, or the independent dimension of reality, as I call it. See episode 202. Language and concepts are part of the dependent dimension of reality, and usually function to differentiate, define, pin things down. Our experience of the independent dimension is timeless, boundaryless, intimate, personal, subjective. So by their very nature, language and concepts are inadequate for describing or expressing it. 3, still, compassionate teachers say something, even if it can only be a finger pointing at the moon. One way to address the conundrum of using words to describe what can never be captured in words is to use words poetically. And this is what Dogen does much of the time. We're not meant to take the words at face value. Although, it's also not very helpful to simply take them as metaphors for something else, as if Dogen could have written it all out straightforwardly in prose, but chose instead to put it into a poetic code. Instead, we should allow the words to evoke something in us and then explore that. And then, although words can't capture the reality of the independent dimension, that doesn't mean we should disregard them or be careless with them. Dogen chooses his words extremely carefully, engaging with his language. Why this word or phrase or image is an important part of opening up to the deeper meaning of his teachings. And finally, Dogen is deeply devoted to pushing his students toward radical non-duality. Our natural tendency is to get attached to fixed and limited concepts, such as I have Buddha nature somewhere deep inside me and I practice to gradually uncover it. Even when there's some truth or value to such a view, reality is much more profound than that. To shake us out of our conceptual nests, Dogen often takes classic teachings like Buddha nature and turns them upside down or changes them, sometimes even appears to contradict them. And then in the next paragraph, he may take his own language and turn that inside out as well. He's not trying to give us a neat idea we can carry away with us. He's trying to confound and blow our limited, discriminating minds. So, hopefully, you can relax when you read Dogen and find your brow furrowed with the frustrating attempt to understand what he's talking about, and then just settle in for the ride. So the translation I'll be reading from is by Guro Nishijima and Shodo Cross. Bussho is chapter 22 in their translation of the Shobogenzo and can be found in volume 2 of their publication. There are certain words and phrases in the text that Nishijima and Cross italicize because Dogen wrote them in Chinese. The rest of his writing was in the colloquial Japanese of his time. They did this throughout the Shobogenzo, and it seems to mean that he wanted to emphasize the words or make it clear that they point to an aspect of the truth that should be investigated carefully. So I'll try to read the italicized words with emphasis, or I'll let you know later if they were italicized. And of course, you can see this in written form on the Zen Studies podcast website. So, quote, Shakyamuni Buddha says, all living beings totally have the Buddha nature. The Tathagata abides in them constantly without changing at all. What is the point of the world-honored one's words that all living beings totally exist as the Buddha nature? It is the words, this is something ineffable coming like this, turning the Dharma wheel. Those called living beings, or called the sentient, or called all forms of life, or called all creatures, are living beings and are all forms of existence. In short, total existence is the Buddha nature. And the perfect totality of total existence is called living beings. At just this moment, the inside and outside of living beings are the total existence of the Buddha nature. End quote. There are numerous words italicized in this passage, but 3 particularly significant and repeated ones are total existence, which Nishijima and Cross also capitalized, and Buddha nature, and living beings. Curiously, Nishijima and Cross translate Dogen's first quotation of Shakyamuni's words slightly differently than the second, where Dogen asks the point of the Buddha's teaching. In the first, Shakyamuni says, all living beings totally have the Buddha nature, while the second sentence is translated as, all living beings totally exist as the Buddha nature. In his translation of the Shobogenzo, Kaz Tanahashi does not do this, phrasing the very first quotation of Shakyamuni as stating, living beings all are Buddha nature. So I don't want to dwell on translation issues too much in this episode, as that's a rabbit hole that can be very interesting and helpful, but also can further complicate efforts to engage with Dogen's text in a deep and personal way. However, I think it's worth investigating this totally have versus totally exist as, because it marks Dogen's radical departure from the classical interpretation of the teaching of Buddha nature. In their footnote about this, Nishijima and Cross explain, quote, totally have is shitsu u, and they give the kanji. Shitsu, or kotogoto, means totally. U, or aru, as a verb, means have or possess, and also exist. And as a noun, it means being or existence. In his commentary, Master Dogen interprets shitsu-u in his own way as an adjective and noun suggesting reality itself, total existence. End quote. I don't read Japanese, and I'm not a professional scholar, so I can't argue for the legitimacy of Nishijima and Cross's interpretation here. However, it makes sense to me that Dogen might accurately quote Shakyamuni at first. After all, by Dogen's time, the teaching of Buddha nature had been phrased as all beings have Buddha nature for over 1,000 years. Throughout the rest of Bussho, most translators seem to agree, Dogen says all beings are Buddha nature, or exist as Buddha nature. However, the ambiguity of the phrase shitsu-u also implies that having Buddha nature and being Buddha nature are not really different, but are like two facets of the same jewel. So let's explore having Buddha nature versus being Buddha nature. Having requires someone to have and something to be had. There's value in looking at reality with a capital R through this lens, as I discuss in episode 239. Awakening to the truths of emptiness and suchness is liberating, but in some senses impersonal. While Buddha nature celebrates the existence of all beings and things, without which there would be no awakening. The teaching, "you have Buddha nature," encourages you to look within, to stop reaching for things outside yourself, to devote yourself to diligently uncovering this true nature, uncovering what is already yours, this treasure. However, the dualisms inherent in having Buddha nature can become an obstacle. You versus your Buddha nature. Having versus not having. Having uncovered your Buddha nature versus not yet having uncovered it. When alternatively, you're told you are Buddha nature, what changes? Now, whatever Buddha nature is, pervades your whole body and mind. There's no special nature residing within you, waiting to be discovered. There's no special nature which exists separately from coverings of delusion and self-centeredness. A special nature with its beauty and luminosity hidden and oppressed by heavy layers of karma. You are Buddha nature suggests you are not even in charge of your practice the way you think you are. Nor are you responsible or to blame for however awakened or unawakened you currently are. Instead, the Buddha nature is manifesting and acting through you. Now, of course, this brief discussion leaves many questions unanswered, but let's move on. What about Dogen's phrase, total existence? He says, all living beings totally exist as the Buddha nature. And total existence is the Buddha nature. And the perfect totality of total existence is called living beings. In sections like this, which happen often in Dogen's writings, it seems sometimes like he's talking in circles, stating that A is B and B is C, and oh, by the way, C is A. It may help to know that stylistically such passages look very different when written in Japanese. English uses a lot of standalone words to indicate relationships and causality, where in Japanese the main words, nouns, adjectives, verbs, are usually represented by kanji, or, fairly ornate and repeated characters interspersed with beginnings and endings written in hiragana, a supplementary form of Japanese script. These beginnings and endings are what give you a clue to the relationships between the characters. The visual emphasis remains much more, though, on the nouns and adjectives and verbs than it does in English, where sentences can seem rather cluttered with particles and prepositions of, is, as, are, and they're written in the same alphabet as the subjects of the sentence. When Dogen seems to be equating or tangling up a whole bunch of words or phrases, he's moving those words or phrases around in his sentences like objects on a shelf. Let's say we had a visual representation of Buddha nature, +1 for all living beings, and 1 for total existence. Then we place them in order on the shelf. Buddha nature, all living beings, total existence. We can make up some prepositions and connecting verbs to make this into a sentence, like Buddha nature is all living beings, total existence, as in the possession, all living beings, total existence. Or Buddha nature is when all living beings have total existence. Then we could switch things up. Total existence, Buddha nature, all living beings. Then we might say, total existence is the Buddha nature of all living beings. If we play with this enough, move those 3 things around, it begins to suggest that the possessive or causative relationships between our 3 items can't be pinned down. Instead, we start to think of our 3 things as being in an intimate and interdependent relationship that is ever-changing. Buddha nature is our true nature, which in at least one Zen text is described as eternal, joyous, selfless, and pure. We are looking for it. We want to awaken to it. All living beings are us. Now, what is total existence? And where does it enter into this picture, this relationship between living beings and their Buddha nature? What is total existence doing up on our metaphorical shelf? Stop for a moment and let the concept of total or totally fill your heart and mind. Synonyms and alternative translations of the Japanese shitsu are entirety, entire, complete, altogether, use up. When we do something totally, we do it wholeheartedly, without reservation, without letting ourselves be stopped by any inhibition, fear, doubt, or anxiety we might feel. We don't hold back, concerned about failure or injury or betrayal. Because we don't hold back, we may fail, we may fall on our faces, but we don't have to wonder in the future what would have happened if we had thrown ourselves into what we were doing 100%. When we do something totally, we let go of our self-consciousness. The perceived separation between us and our activity falls away. So even more profound is the idea of total existence, which isn't even limited to some particular activity, just being, wholeheartedly and completely, without getting caught in worries about our small and separate self. When we totally exist, we recognize there's no boundary between self and all things. As Dogen says, at just this moment, the inside and outside of living beings are the total existence of the Buddha nature. All things are the self, and everything is precious and luminous in its suchness. Of course, the total existence, which is Buddha nature, and which in its own totality is living beings, is not simply a matter, though, of momentary wholeheartedness or a lack of self-consciousness. At such moments, those wholehearted moments, those moments where we lack self-consciousness, we are partaking of total existence and may intuit in what sense we are Buddha nature. But beware of grasping some particular experience and concluding that is it. Now, do not think you do not know, but also don't think you do know. This kind of knowing is not something fixed. For example, what if somebody asks you, what is love? Now, you might throw out a couple definitions that capture important aspects of love, but you would be well aware that such a definition doesn't really answer the question if it is asked sincerely. You might mention some of your experiences of love, times when you know beyond a doubt that love was manifesting in you or in someone else. But you wouldn't propose that your story was anywhere near the final word on the subject. In fact, all of us would probably agree that love is something very real, something we can know intimately and manifest, but not something it makes any sense to claim some kind of understanding of. Probably the best response to the question, what is love, is an in-the-moment demonstration of love. Buddha nature and total existence, and for that matter, living beings, are like this. The knowing inside you, the part of you that knows, is familiar with these things, will be wordless, tender, and undefended. It will feel like a resonance or an intuition, as opposed to a conscious intellectual understanding. At the same time, the mind is not excluded, and the words that were pointing to reality may become clear. It may become obvious why Dogen said it that way. So I will be back in a few days with continued reflections on Bussho. Let's see if I can make it all the way through Dogen's first paragraph. I hope you'll tune in. Thanks for listening.